If you count yourself as an X-Men fan, there are some things I'm sure you're pretty used to. Like someone inevitably coming back from the dead and time-traveling shenanigans making a matter worse, which is either being saved by Magneto or he's just pushing it into further chaos. Now, X-Men 97 Season 2 has all these things, but nobody really expected it to be this good. The initiative was basically to revive the classic animation from the 90s, but what it did was bring back the classic comic lore tucked away in the vaults for years. And the way it ended, with the X-Men waking up in different timelines, meanwhile Apocalypse smoothly entering the picture, I could say the story's just getting started. So in today's video, I'm going to talk about 12 totally insane comic book lore from the X-Men archive that could be a direct inspiration for the upcoming season. The first episode's going to drop very soon, and we've already got an official trailer dropping several hints before it brings the story back into motion. So without further ado, let's get right to it. Blood of Apocalypse. Gambit becomes Death. Season 1 has seen the most heartbreaking sacrifice, which is the death of Remy LeBeau, aka Gambit. He was killed during the attack on Genosha while fighting against the giant Wild Sentinel. However, the Season 1 finale, after Apocalypse's ultimate entrance, we saw him picking up a tattered card of Gambit's, suggesting that instead of death being the end of his story, it'll be his wild card entry for the next season. So yeah, this particular thread is coming right from the Blood of the Apocalypse comic line, where Gambit turned into Death, one of the Horsemen of Apocalypse. But the villain himself didn't choose for his transformation. It was Gambit who volunteered to get close to Apocalypse to keep an eye on him. So, in X-Men Volume 2 Blood of Apocalypse number 182 to 187, this happened after the events of House of M, after Scarlet Witch dropped a nuclear bomb to wipe out all mutant powers. During this time, Apocalypse thought of taking command of this depowered mutant kind and achieving the Celestial Death Seed, so he formed his team consisting of his 4 horsemen. Gazer became War, Polaris became Pestilence, Sunfire turned into Famine, and Gambit became Death. Apocalypse sedated them and made them drink his blood for the transformation, except for Gambit, who avoided the sedation as he wanted to stay aware of the whole process. But no matter how dedicated he was to this undercover assignment, his psychological transformation into Death hit him harder than anything else. Now, I think the next season, which is already meddling with timelines and presumably bringing back Gambit, is most probably going to follow this particular lore from Blood of Apocalypse, but with more emotional angles. Gambit as Death can be a furious enemy for the X-Men, and maybe in the next season, before they fight this eternal mutant, they'll have to fight their dearest Remy in the form of Death.
Your name? My name is En-Sabah-Nur.
The Rise of Apocalypse, En-Sabah-Nur's origin. And then the finale took us to ancient Egypt in 3000 BC, where these lost X-Men, Rogue, Nightcrawler, Magneto, Professor Xavier, and Beast, meet a strange-looking hunk with some scars on his face. And that dude is none other than En-Sabah-Nur, the very first identity Apocalypse was born into. The creators have smoothly brought him into the narrative, but that's not all. Chances are high that we can actually get a full-fledged origin story of Apocalypse in the upcoming season, and the inspiration behind that story will be the 1996 comic series called Rise of Apocalypse, consisting of 4 issues, where we got to see the whole trajectory of Sabah-Nur's past and his ultimate transformation into Marvel's greatest villain of all time. In Rise of Apocalypse, we've got a story of almost 5,000 years old, when Nur was born with gray-colored skin and strange scars on his face, which left him abandoned by the Aqaba people. But it was the tribe of Sandstormers, and especially their leader Baal, who showed kindness to that baby and raised him as his own child. Baal's philosophy of strength literally shaped Nur as a warrior, but Rama-Tut, one of the earliest variants of Kang the Conqueror, already identified Nur's destiny in him. His army killed the Sandstormers and slaughtered Baal, who was the only family for Nur. Now devastated and overwhelmed by vengeance, Nur crossed paths with Ozymandias. But then his broken heart, trying to seek a soft place, fell in love with Nefri, Ozzy's sister. But in the domain of love, looks matter a lot, which also did for Nefri, who was physically repulsed by Sabah-Nur's look and rejected his love. This was a final blow for Nur, who eventually manifested his mutant powers and transformed into Apocalypse. He defeated Rama-Tut and turned Ozymandias into his eternal slave. I don't know if the next season will be more precise on this origin, but I'm surely excited to see how the show will treat Sabah-Nur and the context of the post-fallout of Genosha.
My name is Jean Grey, This is my husband, Scott Summers.
The Adventures of Cyclops and Phoenix, raising Cable in the future. So, listen carefully, as from here on the story's about to get a lot messier. Season 1's finale had opened many doors, and one of them is leaving Scott Summers and Jean Grey stranded in a future timeline with their son, young Nathan, who would later grow up to become a grizzled time-traveling warrior, Cable. Earlier, we see Jean Grey's clone, Madeline Pryor, give birth to a baby Nathan, whose body was ravaged by a techno-organic virus unleashed by Sinister. So, to protect the little boy from this danger, Bishop took him to the future. However, in the season finale, Cable met his mother and opened up about his longing for them. Now, Season 2 is going to tap into that family drama that was left to explore in the first one. But the inspiration behind this development is one hell of a complicated storyline that we got from the X-Men archives. Published in 1994 by Scott Lobdell and Gene Ha, The Adventures of Cyclops and Phoenix is a 4-issue comic miniseries where Jean and Scott travel to the future, but not in their own physical appearances. It was their cloned identities, named Slim and Red Dayspring, who lived in hiding and raised their son Nathan. But just like every other family situation in X-Men lore, their family life didn't sustain for very long. In the comics, Apocalypse's growing dominance forced Nathan to take up his destined role to challenge him. And my premonition is that in the next season, something similar will happen pretty soon. The miniseries also brings strife into Nathan's future story. He was Nathan's clone, created by the Askani as a backup in case Nathan couldn't survive the techno-organic virus before Apocalypse's forces took the clone and raised him as Strife. So chances are high that Season 2 might create a space for a confrontation between Nathan and his brainwashed counterpart. But, after all, I think Season 2 would need to focus on Scott and Jean's newfound family with Nathan, instead of adapting the entire lore of this messy-as-hell 1994 miniseries. However, we gotta remember that Nathan has a full trajectory going on in a different future timeline, where his eventual fate is to become Cable. So let's take a look at a different narrative of Cable's life and see the possibilities of that story getting a chance to be played in the upcoming season. Askani'son, Cable's full origin story. In Season 1, we already got a hint that Cable's childhood was spent mostly in pain and in a constant search for his own identity. That aspect of Cable's story is greatly explored in the 1996 4-issue miniseries Askani'son, written by Scott Lobdell and Jeff Loeb, with art by Gene Ha. Now, why can Askani'son be important for the next season? Well, this 4-issue comic miniseries showed the coming-of-age story of Nathan Summers, as he grew up to become Cable. And we might get a specific episode dedicated to Cable's journey of being raised by Mother Askani. So what happened was that after Nathan was sent into the future for a cure to the techno-organic virus that was slowly killing him, he was raised by Mother Askani, who protected him. Mother Askani is mainly known as the founder of Clan Askani, the mutant-powered resistance group against Apocalypse's tyranny. But her real identity was Rachel Summers, Scott and Jean's other long-lost daughter who grew up in a future timeline. Now, Rachel believed that Nathan was the ultimate destined child to face Apocalypse, but the Askani also had a cloned Nathan as a backup in case the techno-organic virus killed him. Apocalypse's forces later found that clone, and Apocalypse raised him as Strife. However, despite these challenges, Nathan did what he was destined to do. Defeated and killed Apocalypse. Now, there's a high potential for the next season to explore this futuristic rebel group of Askani, who are the only ones to hold on to Xavier's ideologies in a world where it's almost extinct. Also, we can get a final showdown between the Tyrant and Nathan, who's about to put an end to his tenure. Fatal Attractions: How the Seed of Onslaught was planted. Season 1, Episode 9, titled Tolerance is Extinction Part 2, adapted the Fatal Attractions lore, especially the moment where Magneto ripped off the adamantium from Wolverine's bones. In the 1993 Fatal Attractions arc, before even Onslaught emerged, this incident took place pretty painfully. Xavier and his old friend Magneto's relationship took a terrifying turn when both of them made a decision under an uncontrollable situation. In the comics, Magneto returned from his near-death experience and created a new sanctuary for mutants called Avalon, which was previously known as Asteroid M. But this Magneto is not the old Magneto we saw working with the X-Men. This Magneto has been disillusioned and now has a cynical ideology on the concept of coexistence. He and his followers believe that this is the time they needed to apply brute force to help the mutant kind survive. So, as usual, Xavier opposed this idea, and he brought his team form mainly to stop Magneto from making further destructive decisions. Wolverine was that unfortunate guy who got dragged in the middle because he just attacked Magneto. In extreme rage and pain, Magneto counterattacked Wolverine, and using his brutally strong electromagnetic force, he ripped the adamantium off Wolverine's skeleton, leaving him almost on the brink of death. Xavier had to intervene because the lead warrior of his team, Wolverine, had been shot down. Xavier used his telepathic power to shut down Magneto's electromagnetic force, which left his old friend in a catatonic state. I think the second season of X-Men 97 will see the aftermath of Xavier and Magneto's ultimate showdown, which is mainly Wolverine's healing process without adamantium, and Xavier going through the guilt for lobotomizing his friend. By now, it also hints at the possible arc of Onslaught's birth, and that can be a different discussion. Onslaught. Xavier and Magneto's dark side merged into a god. Speaking of Onslaught's birth, let me clear out a popular misconception about how he originated. So, Onslaught wasn't just born out of the fusion between Magneto and Xavier's powers. Rather, it was all Xavier who suppressed emotions, rage, and his inner darkness, absorbing bits of Magneto's psyche during the events of Fatal Attractions, created a villainous force of Onslaught. After years of being buried within Xavier's mind, this dark psionic presence evolved and took the form of an entity after gaining its own consciousness. After becoming self-aware, the entity began to manipulate events, and over time, it was established that Onslaught isn't interested in Xavier's ideology at all. He saw Xavier's kindness as his weakness, and neither did he like what Magneto was doing. He wanted to be free of Magneto and Xavier's influence and dominate humanity and the mutants independently, trying to rebuild the world through his own psychic energy. In the 1996 Onslaught saga, not just X-Men, but also the Avengers and the Fantastic Four joined a battle against Onslaught to stop it. But after both these factions sacrificed themselves in the battle, Franklin Richards used his reality-bending powers and brought them all back within a pocket universe. So while we talk about the possible plots in X-Men 97 Season 2, the Onslaught saga might be one of them, and a pretty important one. Since we've already seen the showdown between Xavier and Magneto and their massive energy absorption, I think it's already sowed the seeds for Onslaught's rise in the next season. Those who've read the comics are well aware of this character. You guys know that Onslaught can surpass even Bastion in both terms of power and malevolence. So the upcoming season might have a chance to explore one of the greatest Omega-level mutant villains alongside Apocalypse. Wolverine Bone Claws era, feral and stripped of everything. As I said, Logan went through a major healing process after the adamantium was ripped off his skeleton, and I think Season 2 is going to delve deeper into that lore even more to show how Logan found his raw powers and understood who he truly was before Magneto's attack. So, Wolverine initially thought that these claws were actually part of the Weapon X experiment, but that wasn't the case. When Magneto stripped the metal from his skeleton, he then realized that he had bone claws that he could pop out of his knuckles. They weren't just lab experiment results, but Wolverine's own innate powers. But it took some time for Logan to get to that conclusion, as he thought that without the metal in his body, he could no longer fight his enemies. In Wolverine number 76 through 81, we see him wandering alone and vulnerable, but even during this time, he was always surrounded by enemies and people who wanted to seek revenge on him. One of them was Lady Deathstrike, who thought Wolverine's bone claws infused with adamantium were actually stolen from her father's work. But when Deathstrike learned that Logan no longer had his claws, she stopped resenting it. Then another confrontation occurred between him and Cyber, who got his adamantium skin of his own. It turned out that Wolverine is still a fierce warrior even with or without adamantium, and that is a necessary evolution of his character that Season 2 of X-Men 97 might want to explore. Phalanx Covenant, techno-organic invasion of Earth. X-Men 97 Season 1 gave us Bastion as the main villain of the arc, who was part human and machine, whose origin was connected to Sentinels. But this mutant-hating phenomenon can be seen throughout X-Men lore in various other forms, and one of them is the Phalanx Covenant storyline, which is most likely to be portrayed in the upcoming season of X-Men 97. The comic line of Phalanx Covenant introduced us to an alien hive mind structure called the Phalanx, that hated mutants and wanted to assimilate them. They were originally aliens, but some humans also joined the group out of sheer hate for mutant kind. Now they find the remnants of Warlock and collected the transmode virus, which they used on themselves as a curated infection and, as a result, became this techno-organic collective consciousness. The virus transformed them into some technically fused humans who can no longer call themselves humans. Now, their most imminent target became the new generation of mutants, who were rescued by Banshee and Emma Frost and later transformed into the newly forged group of young mutants called Generation X. I think in the next season of X-Men 97, we can see the rise of new mutants in the present timeline. Since the post-Genosha fall, the X-Men are already lost and scattered around different timelines. In the Phalanx Covenant storyline, Cable also became an important part to stop the future timeline from collapsing. So yeah, since Cable's going to take a major place in the next season, we can see him getting into this Covenant trouble as well. Astonishing X-Men, dangerous. The Danger Room wakes up. The Season 2 trailer has already dropped a major hint of bringing X-Men's most underrated and misunderstood villain of all time, Danger, and to see what role she might take up in the upcoming season, we just gotta go back to her roots in the comics. In 2005, Astonishing X-Men number 7 through 12, written by Joss Whedon with art by John Cassaday, Danger Room was first known to have developed a consciousness, and the main reason for this was Charles Xavier's repeated experiments on the room and inclusion of high-end technology, especially the alien technology of the Shi'ar. And the worst part was that Xavier was already aware of this training room gaining gradual sentience, but he still didn't stop doing his future experiments on it, pushing all its buttons until the room itself became an enemy. Danger Room was the very room where X-Men members used to practice their skills. Initially, it was just a practice field that used to change its forms, turning into a simulation of battlefield for the X-Men members to hone their skills against those simulated threats. But after becoming sentient, it broke free from its conventional role. After, Danger Room turned into a feminine humanoid body calling herself Danger. She unleashed violence and even killed a mutant student named Wing. So you can already imagine how dangerous she's going to be if she ever comes into this form. In the next season, it's been predicted that we might get to see an episode or two dedicated to this dangerous arc. Maybe building a narrative space to show the flawed side of Charles Xavier instead of hero-worshipping him all the time. New X-Men, Morrison's era, and the black leather look. While the Season 2 trailer has heavily hinted at the new X-Men storyline, among which the most highlighted will be the one written by Grant Morrison and illustrated by Frank Quitely. From issues 114 to 117, especially around the E for Extinction lore, where we see an unprecedented rise of mutants almost everywhere in the world. Xavier's School for Mutants was initially a private headquarters, but now it's turned into a full-fledged educational institution solely dedicated to mutant children. So instead of just teaching the mutants how they can protect themselves, the X-Men are teaching the next generation how to inherit their powers. Then, we also saw the black leather costumes worn by the X-Men members to take on the form of a field operative or training instructor within the institution. These uniform-style costumes were mainly inspired by the X-Men films, and now seeing the trailer, I think the return of these costumes is confirmed by far. The new and young mutants will increase in numbers, and this threatened mutant kind will no longer be a small community. Now the question is, if the world will be sprawling with too many mutants, will there be any point of coexistence? Or will the violence against mutants just increase unabashedly? Maybe Season 2 will pick that up in the latter part of their run and give us the befitting answers to these queries. X-Factor with Forge, the true path. Season 1 has showed us a secluded and depowered Storm who met with Forge, but after that meetup, Forge's arch-enemy Adversary, who feeds on trauma, began to haunt Storm and leave her in a fragile state of mind. Meanwhile, Forge was partly responsible for Storm losing her powers because he was the one who created the technology that the government and anti-mutant groups like Executioner used to build mutant inhibitor collars, which neutralized Storm's powers. So Forge wanted to make it up to her by restoring her powers, but this came with Adversary lurking in the corner. Now, inspiring this development is the main storyline from the 1996 issue X-Factor 121, The True Path, written by Howard Mackie and illustrated by Steve Epting. Here, we got a clear picture of Forge being two different ideologies merged into one. One of them is a scientific and brilliant inventor, and the other is a shaman who can connect to the spirits and have visions of supernatural happenings. For this unique power, Adversary, an ancient trickster, began to haunt him since the beginning of the Vietnam War. After a long time struggling with these splitting personalities, Forge finally learned to accept the fact that if he stayed divided in his mind, his enemies would have a stronger impact on him. So, he decided to unify his two different ideologies and finally created a weapon that can take down Adversary. Right now, Season 1 has already introduced us to this possibility that in Season 2, we might get to see Forge facing off against his nemesis and save Storm from his hauntings, before he's gonna fall in love with it. Age of Apocalypse, the timeline where Xavier never existed. Age of Apocalypse officially began with the 1995 publication of the very first issue of X-Men Alpha. It was based on a single idea. What if Charles Xavier didn't live long enough to create the X-Men after all? This happened because of a time-traveling incident where his son Legion went back in time to kill Magneto, but Xavier, intending to save his old mate, sacrificed his own life. His death in this situation actually happened long before he made his visions of the X-Men come to life. But then Apocalypse came back to dominate Earth because every time humanity and mutant kind were in a vulnerable position, he would emerge to take his chance. But this time there was no one to thwart him as Xavier was absent, and there was a huge power vacuum in the middle that Apocalypse was trying to take advantage of. So Magneto had to step in. As I said, you can never understand when exactly he's going to protect the world or push it to further doom. But whatever, this time he took up the role of the savior to honor his deceased friend Xavier, who once saved his life. He formed this version of the X-Men just to preserve Xavier's dream in this world, so Rogue led the resistance against Apocalypse, and Quicksilver helped them rescue mutants from execution. Now, we've already discussed in previous segments how these scattered arcs of Apocalypse's age will be covered in Season 2. So last but not least, I can assume that if the show wanted to adapt a darker timeline to show an alternative reality where Magneto took the helm, Age of Apocalypse would be an ideal inspiration. So the speculations will go on until I get to experience the very first episode premiering on my TV screen. As promised, these are the 12 most common assumptions I've got so far from the newly dropped trailer, but for the creators of the series, there's no end of inspiration because X-Men has an ocean of comic arcs that can't be covered in just a 10-episode season. And that vastness of the lore is what intrigues me as a diehard fan of the comics. I hope it'll continue to do so, but on that note, this video is over. If you've enjoyed the discussion, please don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons on our channel and ring that notification bell so that when we get more X-Men content, we can bring it straight to you. Also, let us know your assumptions about the second season in the comments below. Until then, goodbye, we'll see you in the next one.